So my name is Amy Stornaiuolo, and I am an associate professor of literacy education here at the University of Philadelphia, in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania. And I am in the reading, writing, and literacy department, which is housed within kind of a larger division around literacy, culture, and international education. And so my areas of expertise are really around digital literacies, adolescent and adult literacies, and writing studies, in particular writing in new media. And I also do some work in cross-cultural and global context. So I think the piece that you all will be reading is the one around cosmopolitanism. So that was a lot of the work that I did for my dissertation and beyond. And so my work in many ways kind of crisscrosses a few fields. So writing studies, media studies, and literacy. And that's kind of how I see myself situated at the nexus of those fields. I'm teaching a class on digital methods this term. And so I've been reading a lot about that actually, and thinking about its roots in digits, as in fingers, so things that we do with our fingers, which I think is an interesting kind of haptic lens to bring to the digital, which we often think of as kind of external to people and bodies in terms of digital technologies that exist out there, algorithms and code and kind of the internet as external to people. And so I think kind of rooting it in those historical understandings of the digital, and thinking really particularly about Christina Haas's work on materiality, and thinking about technology as encompassing a lot of different materials that are used to extend humans' capacity to make meaning with the world around them. So thinking about the pencil, right, the mechanical pencil as one of the earliest, well, pencils more generally as one of the earliest technologies, and then mechanical pencils is kind of an iteration on that. So as Bolter and Grusin talk a lot about remediation, so the ways that old technologies are remediated through new technologies, and part of the task of that remediation is making it seem as if it's all new. For example, Facebook Live is all new when really it's kind of a culmination of many years of technological innovation. So the digital for me kind of has that historical resonance of in the body and in kind of human meaning making, using the technologies at hand. And so now the technologies at hand are extended into the virtual in the sense of zeros and ones, kind of making up the code that allow us to engage with these kind of more ephemeral and less embodied and materially situated realms that we can engage. So I would say that for me, the digital kind of brings that history to bear and extends it into new context, environments, and realms that are less embodied but still involve the human in kind of centrally important ways. I've been thinking a lot about methodologies, and it's something that John Wargo and I have talked about a lot in our mutually overlapping work, which is that some of the more traditional qualitative methodologies continue to have affordances when studying digital practices, but also then bring new challenges that require new ways of thinking about methods. So, for example, if we think about interviewing as kind of a key way that we understand other people's experiences and life worlds and perspectives, and in their own words and from their own kind of epistemological positionings, interviews have been a real staple of qualitative methodology. But those are shifting when we think about bringing in the digital. So what does it mean to do an interview in a virtual context. So that could be what we're doing now, right? The face-to-face, which has a lot of overlapping similarities, but can also be challenging to feel like you really know someone, or that figuring out the overlaps and where pauses should be and how much of a role the interviewer should take up, especially if you don't know somebody very well. Then I've interviewed people on GChat, I've interviewed people over email, a lot of times people I haven't met. And so then the interview just becomes a series of kind of textual exchanges rather than like a conversational building and rapport relationship kind of mutuality that I think a lot of the best interviews have, because you've built up a relationship with the person. So I think that all of those things really shift and need other kinds of methods to get at what we might want as researchers, which is to build relationships with the people that we're studying, to really understand their worldview and kind of their perspective and thinking, and to really be able to trace that over time and over context. So we're kind of established in one particular location, but what we know about the way digital practices work is they move. People are at the same time that we're talking, maybe checking the email in the background and looking at the text messages that are coming up, and maybe jotting notes on my notepad and exchanging a glance with somebody off camera, right? So there's all these layers that you miss when you're doing that. And then that doesn't even begin to account for the ways that the digital methods need to shift when you're just maybe scraping Twitter, right? You don't know, there are no people behind those accounts necessarily. So let's say I'm working with one writer, and I'm following this adolescence writer across spaces and time. Well, I'm gonna, like Pamela Takayoshi writes about this, and I think it's really excellent the way she thinks about all these unintended visitors. So I'm interested in, maybe Kathy is my focal participant, but Kathy's got a lot of networks and a lot of contacts. And so all these people then get pulled into my study. What do I do with their data? They didn't consent to be part of this. Do I analyze that? How do I think about that? Can I report on that? I mean, that's where the gold is in the interaction that I'm witnessing, as maybe she gives feedback to somebody in Wattpad. But how do I deal with these unintended visitors? Or if I ask her to screenshot her or to screen capture her writing session, maybe she doesn't want me to see the address that's on the address bar or some of the tabs that are open. So how, as a researcher, do I navigate privacy and the different ethics of these unintended visitors, whether those are people or like addresses or images on the screen? So I think that those are some of the benefits of these digital methods, but also some of the challenges is, where are our ethical boundaries as researchers? How do we build relationships when we might just be like scraping a hashtag on Twitter and doing a computational analysis? But these are connected to people. And so yes, they're public data and I can scrape them, but ethically, should I? And what are my obligations to people and as kind of research participants, unintended or otherwise? So I think that those are some of the challenges that I've been grappling with. Also, even how to follow people. So Bryce Nordquist and I have talked about some of his go-along methods. So he'll wear a GoPro strapped to his body and like take public transportation with kids, and then also have other cameras that he'll like zoom in. So if you've seen some of his presentations, he'll have the GoPro footage as the background, then he'll have the footage of the kid on the train texting, and then he'll have the screen capture footage that he had installed on the kid's phone so we could see what he's texting and what he's doing across tabs. So that's an excellent way of kind of capturing mobility. But then some of the ethical questions that arise are, what are the participants' rights to privacy? How much does it veer into surveillance versus research methods? And those are all like challenges that I regularly grapple with, especially when I'm working with youth from non-dominant communities who are often my research participants, when there's a long history of colonial gaze and surveillance. And so in what ways does my use of video or screen capture technology play into those logics in ways that position me as a white middle-class university researcher surveilling young people of color, even if it's for the most altruistic of purposes, and I will not use that in any kind of unethical way, it still reinforces those kind of hierarchical and colonial and white supremacist logics. So I think that those are all questions that I think they're questions more generally for qualitative research, but I think they're really particular to online and digital methods that we need to grapple with. One of the fallacies that we fall into as educators and researchers, but less so as researchers, but more as educators, is kind of continuing to see the digital and non-digital as like two realms that are separate, right? And they may cross over, et cetera. But I just think we can't continue to reify these as contexts that have these boundaries that we can say, now we're in the classroom and you're going to use your phone in these XYZ ways. And now you're at recess, so you can do these other things, but not all of them, because, you know, between the district blockages and et cetera, you might be able to have your phone, but then you can't get on certain websites. And then when you're at home, you can do whatever you want, and, you know, you might be gaming and doing other things. And so seeing these as like kind of three distinct spaces, so in school, kind of adjacent to school, and completely out of school. And I think that one of the dangers of doing that as educators is that we don't take advantage in as full of ways as we can about the how infused these digital practices are into our everyday ways of thinking and being and acting and engaging in the world. And I think as adults, we often, we say, no devices in our classroom. They're just going to pay attention to me, right? And we've seen these studies around how, you know, taking notes on the computer actually makes comprehension worse, et cetera, et cetera. And so there is a justification for banning computers or banning technologies in the classroom. Or, you know, as one of the schools, they would take the phone and somebody on the street would, like at a corner store or something, would hold the phone for them for the day for like $1 or $2, and then they would come pick it up because it would get confiscated at school. So there are all these policies trying to really control the way, and I see why, and it is logical in the one sense, because you want people's attention. But then if you look at the way adults sit in faculty meetings, et cetera, like we look at our phone, we check social media, we listen, and then we're like, we're done with this now, we're going to take a little break, I'm going to send a text, right? So we don't do it, but we expect that the young people are going to have 100% attention on us all the time. So I think that there's a lot of ways that it is and should be shifting education that we haven't really reconciled with. And then, of course, there's all the digital equity issues, which is that the most well-off and well-endowed schools don't do that, right? What they do, they don't regulate and control in nearly the same way. So, for example, there's a school here in Philadelphia that I work with, and they're a one-to-one school, and anybody can use any device at any time. And then the teachers set policies around, okay, when we're doing this, all devices are off and we're all in it, right? And then you can use it at other times. And it's really part of a very rich, digitally connected school that where they're constantly reading, let's say, the things they carried. They were reading that. They're listening to a contemporary podcast around like war. And then they're also participating in an online discussion that they're having about that. And they're kind of doing those three things simultaneously as they're kind of creating these really great inquiry projects that they're using these different resources to build. So the teachers give the kids a lot of autonomy over where they're going to be spending their time and which resources they're going to draw upon, as well as like layering those resources throughout. Whereas a school just down the street that I've worked at that really like is much less well off. It serves primarily African-American students from socioeconomically challenged neighborhoods. And everybody's nobody can have a phone, nobody can use a computer. They have a worksheet that they're filling out that they spend the entire period doing. And when you kind of put those two things side by side, it really reinforces, and there's a lot of research around this, who gets to, as a reward, do digital projects, and then it just, of course, exacerbates inequities. So I think that those are all things we have to grapple with as educators, is in what ways are those tied to socioeconomic and racial logics around where the digital fits, but also like how we even start to think about these realms as intertwined, and in what ways that can enrich and enliven our pedagogies and our practices as educators. I think some of the current work um, in critical digital literacies is really interesting, especially, so I mentioned at the beginning that I do some cross-cultural and international work. Um, and so I think that that is a focus that is not taken up. We're very American centric and English centric in a lot of our questions. So I think that the critical digital literacies, where we really take an analysis of power into account, and then there's an international critical digital literacies group that's been formed that I've been finding really powerful in pushing some of my thinking cross-culturally, as well as like, so thinking about culture and power in relationships. So I think those questions are some of the most interesting to me, and where I think the field needs to go. I think we have enough studies, John's heard me say this, that say like, wow, you know, people make meaning across multiple modes, and I'm going to tell you how these modes work together, right? And so, you know, I did that work, so I'm, you know, implicating myself here in the early days, and my mentor was Glinda Hull, and so we did a lot of digital storytelling work with youth in Oakland. And, you know, we spent a lot of time thinking about the ways that image and sound and text all played in relationship to one another in their digital stories, and then how they made meaning more broadly. And I think that was kind of cutting edge work and important to do, drawing on the work of Gunter Kress and a lot of the social semioticians back in the day. But I think we've like well established now that people make meaning multimodally. And I don't know that it's gotten 100% into schools, but I think a lot of, I mean, I think elementary schools have always been pretty radically multimodal, but I think now in adolescent literacy, it's becoming more accepted. But what we haven't done yet is move beyond the celebration of the digital. Like, we're going to empower youth to have, you know, their voices heard, which every word in that sentence is problematic to me. But that there's a lot of research around that, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the celebratory, because I think that a lot of times there have been deficit narratives around youth of color and their meaning-making practices. So that's what a lot of the work with Ebony Thomas and I have done on restoring, as the kind of celebratory work of what does it mean to be able to kind of counter-narrate some of those discourses. So I'm not saying that that's not needed at all, but I think that we need to go beyond the celebratory to understand in what ways can we ask different kinds of questions as researchers, and think about implications for education, where we don't just, as Dr. Thomas says, like build a better mousetrap. So what are the ways that we're constantly like reinventing teaching, but that still keep the logics that disenfranchise large portions of our teaching, of our students' population in place, but how are ways we can use the digital to really push on and make systemic transformations to the way that school works. So I think that some of those questions are the most interesting to me, and like methodologically, how do you do that? How do you study that? I do a lot of work around transliteracies, so thinking about how as researchers we move across context with and kind of alongside the participants that we're working with, and what are methods that can help us do that, and what are analytic tools that can help us see that. So I think those are all questions that I'm still interested in.